water. You have indeed taken a step toward increasing the price of food. The bill that we will consider later this week is a comprehensive solution that would restore water deliveries that have been cut off due to federal regulations and environmental lawsuits and the plethora of things facing the California farmers.
Will the gentleman yield for 1 second?
I will be happy to.
I hear what the gentleman's saying. I agree wholeheartedly. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is the issue is not regulation. The issue is excessive regulation. The issue is over-regulation. I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. I love them dearly and hate to get on that plane when I have to come up here from Arkansas and have to leave them back at the house. And I want them to have clean air and clean water. So I don't know anyone, the folks here tonight included, who are against all regulation. Regulation, used properly, protects us, kids, etc. This is not about whether to regulate or not. This is about excessive regulation, over-regulation, regulation that do not, the regulatory process that does not consider cost benefit, that does not consider impact on jobs, that does not employ common sense. Washington regulators that don't speak with folks impacted on the ground, that don't, well-intentioned though they may be, that don't look at the impact and potential impact of their over-regulation. That's what I hear from my colleagues. I agree wholeheartedly, and I think that is a critical distinction to point out, because we always hear folks saying, you just want no regulation. That's a false choice. That's a straw man. That's not anyone's argument that I've heard. The issue is one of over-regulation, excessive regulation. I yield back to the gentleman.
And let me take it a step further, because I can relate to what the gentleman is talking about and relate it back to my home district. And I think the gentleman would agree that over the last several years that in Arkansas there has been a phenomenal rate of growth in the northwest part of our state. The area that I happen to represent, the great 3rd District of Arkansas, it's known for its incredible growth over the last several years. Now, it is home to some pretty well-known companies, companies like Walmart and J.B. Hunt Trucking and Tyson Foods. And if you look at northwest Arkansas, there's really no compelling reason why, prior to the establishment of those major companies, that northwest Arkansas would be an area where you would have this unprecedented growth. But because of the entrepreneurial spirit and drive of guys like Sam Walton and Don Tyson and J.B. Hunt, and I could go down another list of people that have provided jobs and created and expanded businesses and have made a meaningful impact on the greater Mid-South and the entire nation, but for their entrepreneurial spirit, northwest Arkansas would be kind of an average area. No great infrastructure until recently there, and no real compelling reason why it would be anything special. But we're fighting an issue in the greater northwest Arkansas area that could indeed impact our ability to continue to grow, and I'm talking about EPA's desire, insatiable appetite to put a total maximum daily load, a TMDL if you will, on phosphorus loading in the Illinois River watershed that flows into Oklahoma because of a loading standard imposed on northwest Arkansas by our neighboring state that many say is not even achievable. And so all of the great development and job creation and the elevated quality of life is in jeopardy. Future is in jeopardy as a result of a federal agency imposing on the region a standard that may or may not even be able to be achieved. And I bring that up for this reason. Back when I was the mayor of a city in northwest Arkansas, I challenged EPA to give us the science, to show us exactly how they can calculate that this standard has been impacted by the farmers and ranchers of northwest Arkansas and those that manage the point sources of pollution, the municipalities. And I happen to be the mayor presided over one of those. And as I understand it, the science was a collection of data from about 20 streams somewhere in America not known to us, and they took, I think, the 75th percentile of the average phosphorus loading into those streams. I doubt seriously that they used streams and rivers that were similar to what we were dealing with in northwest Arkansas. And I bring up this subject only because we're talking about job creation tonight. And our ability to continue to expand the economy in northwest Arkansas is dependent on our ability to have a good, clean water supply and to be able to treat our wastewater and to be able to discharge it properly and sufficiently to be able to create growth. But I'm afraid one day we're going to look up, and because of these standards imposed on us by the federal bureaucracy, this overregulation that we've talked about, we're not going to have an opportunity to grow because we're going to be into moratoriums on growth and development in our area as a result of these unfair standards. But that's a whole other story. I really came tonight to talk with my colleague about tax reform because, as we've indicated, the threat of higher taxes, or the tax structure as we now know it, is, in my strongest opinion, one of the great barriers to job creation. You know, just the other day, in this very chamber, the President of the United States stood in the dais and he talked to this Congress about the need for comprehensive tax reform and his proposal to reform the corporate tax code. I was pleased to see the President showing some leadership in that regard, and I look forward to working with the administration and my colleagues in the House and Senate to do something that, in my strong opinion, is long overdue. I, along with many of my colleagues, agree on the need for corporate tax reform. The U.S. has one of the highest corporate tax structures in the world, second only to Japan. And this discourages job growth and job creation in the United States. It's time to broaden the base. Time to get the government out of the business of picking winners and losers. Time to eliminate special interest loopholes. And it's time to lower the corporate tax rate once and for all. But corporate tax reform is not the only piece of the puzzle. There are many other pieces. If we're going to grow the economy and give our job creators the certainty they need to invest, we also should look at the individual rates, not just the corporate rates, but the individual structure as well. There's an opportunity to simplify the individual tax code. In December of 2010, according to the Compendium of Tax Expenditures prepared by the Congressional Research Service that we all use, there were more than 300 tax expenditures in the form of special exclusions, exemptions, deductions, credits, rates, and deferrals. We need to reevaluate every single one of these expenditures. There are many other benefits of comprehensive tax reform. For example, more than 90% of the Treasury's budget goes to the IRS. If we simplify the tax code and make it easier to follow and enforce, the IRS doesn't need the resources it currently needs. What's more, IRS reported, and I think these numbers were back in 2006, hundreds of billions, I think somewhere just short of $400 billion of what we call a tax gap. Again, simplification of the tax code makes it easier to follow and enforce, and we can significantly narrow that gap. I thank my colleagues from both sides of the aisle who are looking forward to working on comprehensive tax reform. I believe in my heart that it is, as my colleague from Arkansas has indicated, it's one of four things, four basic issues facing America today that can help put our job creators back into the business of doing what they do best, and that is having ideas, incubating those ideas, making those ideas come to reality, taking the necessary risks, having access to the capital to help support those businesses, to expand those businesses by hiring people, by growing things, by making things. And as my friend from Virginia said a moment ago, we have proven that the American worker is the most productive worker in the world. And that's what we need to do. And I believe that corporate tax reform, ending this excessive over-regulatory environment that we're in, to access American energy solutions, to solve America's energy challenges, and once and for all, doing something about the extraordinary deficits, 4 straight trillion-plus dollar deficits facing America, and nearly trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see, based on the current glide path. To do those things necessary to get our deficit under control, to begin to whittle down that debt and save future generations of the burdens that we have, in an almost immoral way, put on their shoulders. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time, and thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight.
I thank my friend from the 3rd District of Arkansas and appreciate his comments here tonight. I'd like to continue talking a little bit about tax reform. Since Representative Womack was talking about some aspects of the President's proposal, I think most of us around here are certainly excited that the President has even started discussing fundamental tax reform. Unfortunately, I think that the President's proposal has a lot of aspects that would be burdensome to the businesses and the job creators that he purports to be trying to help. And so I don't think that it has much chance in the House or the Senate, and I think he knew that when he proposed it. But at least he's having that conversation. That's a start. That's a start. As we talked about, whether you're talking about tax reform, energy exploration, regulatory reform, or common sense budgeting, making the federal government live within its means, all of those relate to jobs. They all are directly related to encouraging private sector job creation. And we've been working on a highway bill recently. Infrastructure is a critical part of this equation. That's part of the spending our money wisely under the budgeting side of things, because we need a strong infrastructure so that we can compete with other countries, continue to have economic development in this country. So that's a critical part of it. But with regard to the President's tax plan, it raises taxes at least $1 for every $1 in tax cuts that he provides to simplify the corporate tax code. It creates a whole new category of taxes for our companies that do business overseas. And most glaringly, it doesn't do anything to address individual tax rates, the tax rates that you pay at home, I pay. And why is that important for job creation? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, the code we have now is complex. Doesn't always reward hard work. In fact, sometimes it punishes it. But one of the real specific reasons why we must deal with the individual tax rates to grow jobs is because many businesses pay their taxes, particularly LLCs, sole proprietorships, partnerships, mom-and-pop businesses all around the country, in Arkansas and in my district. They pay their taxes using the individual income tax brackets. So you can't just address the corporate tax code, although the President's corporate tax, quote, reform, it's got a lot of tax hikes in it. It'll make our businesses, our job creators in this country less competitive. But you can't just reform the tax code by dealing with corporate tax reform. You've got to look at individual tax reform, corporate tax reform, across the board. You have to make it simpler, fairer, and flatter. Some of the terms that we've talked about, we've certainly advocated for that in our budget last year, and we're going to do that again this year. It's critical, not only for job creation by larger businesses, but by small businesses, mom-and-pop businesses. So tax reform is a critical part of what we need to do to get jobs going. As I've talked about earlier, some of my colleagues talked about, there are a number of reforms that we have been pursuing for over a year now that relate directly to private sector job creation. As I indicated earlier, it's tax reform, it's regulatory reform, it's more energy development, it's living within our means. Individually, these issues may not have jobs in the title, but they are the columns, the supports that hold up the private sector job building, if you will. And I want to say a couple of things about the regulatory issue, because I've just introduced a bill, H.R. 4078. It's the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act. Again, as a lot of us said, I'm not anti-regulation. I don't know anyone that's against regulations across the board. What I'm against is the federal government failing to apply common sense when regulating. What I'm against are excessive regulations, overly burdensome regulations. I'll give you an example. I had a jobs conference down in my district in Little Rock at the Clinton Presidential Library. We had a jobs conference. We invited a number of job creators. Seems to me, if you want to know what to do to create private sector jobs or encourage private sector job creation, you'd ask someone who had actually created them. Folks from the private sector, experts on this issue. We invited them in and said, hey, what's the biggest obstacle to job creation? We had Democrats, we had Republicans, both. And we asked them just point blank. And the number one answer was regulatory uncertainty. What does that mean? Well, it means that folks have money that they might want to invest, but they hold on tight to that money because they're not quite sure what's going to happen. They're not sure whether we're going to get our debt under control or not. They're not sure how much Obamacare, the President's health care law, is going to cost them. They're not sure whether the regulations that they've heard proposed by the EPA as potentially being proposed, they're not sure whether those are going to be implemented or not. It's just uncertainty everywhere. And I had someone say to me the other night, well, there's always uncertainty. Well, yeah, there is always uncertainty. If you're a farmer, there's uncertainty whether there's going to be enough rain for the crops that year. There's always going to be some uncertainty in life because we don't have crystal balls. I get that. But what we don't want is a federal government that needlessly creates additional uncertainty. You know, sometimes we say, whew, I had enough problems before this came along. Well, that's what we're talking about. You've got enough to deal with naturally. You've got enough uncertainty as it is. You don't need the federal government creating more uncertainty. If you talk to community banks who have been impacted by the President's Dodd-Frank law, they got a lot of uncertainty. Having to hire new folks to comply with the law. What are the new regulations going to be? Don't know yet. Just know they're coming. Don't know what they're going to be yet. Just know they're coming. Just know they're going to be burdensome. Same with the health care law. Here's a quote from actually a well-known Democrat businessman, commissioner on the Arkansas Highway Commission, appointed by our Democrat governor in Arkansas, former chairman of the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, John Burkhalter. He said at my jobs conference, quote, "Every project I look at now, I've got to wonder if I'm going to get to build it because are the regulations going to stop me? I've got to admit that I pass on over 50% of the projects I'd like to do because of the burden, the hurdle of the regulations," end quote. Now, the President recently said in his State of the Union address that he's approved fewer regulations in the first 3 years of his presidency than his Republican predecessor did in his. Well, the President said that sitting right here on the floor of the House during the State of the Union this year, so I think it deserves some attention. Well, is that true? If you just look at the numbers, it's true. If you just look at the number of regulations. But if you look at the number of what are called major regulations and the burden that it puts, the cost of the regulations, what this President has done far exceeds what we've seen before. The previous administration issued an average of 63 major regulations per year. This administration has issued an average of 88, an increase of 40%. Under President Bush, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs reviewed an average of 77 economically significant regulations biannually. These are the ones that really impact business. We're not talking about a minor regulation here or there. We're talking about the ones that really impact job creators. Under President Bush, his Office of Regulatory Affairs reviewed about 77 every 2 years. Under this President, it's 125. Not quite doubled, but not far from it. If the administration maintains its current pace, it would add nearly $150 billion annually in new regulatory costs over 8 years. I'm going to yield to my friend from Virginia, but before I do, I just want to mention that I have proposed a Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act, H.R. 4078, because what it would do, it would basically freeze the introduction and progression of major regulations, those having an impact of $100 billion or more. It would freeze those with exceptions for emergencies, health issues, what have you. There are exceptions in the bill, but it would freeze them until our unemployment rate gets down to 6% to show that we're getting our footing, because what the economic and the regulatory environment is doing to our job creators is stifling their ability to create jobs. So I'm going to yield now to my colleague from Virginia.
Well, I thank you so much. I stuck around just because I wanted to hear more about your Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act. I think that is a great concept. I look forward to reading it. It's the way and the direction that we ought to be going, because I'm willing to bet that those regulations that have been approved are probably, if you looked at the inches of the regulations, it might only be one reg, but I'll be willing to bet that this administration beats the Bush administration on inches of regulation by a mile. That being said, I have to also say that, you know, I go out and I talk to not only the Rotary clubs and other civic organizations, but I like talking to high school students, because what we do here in Washington will be a far greater impact on their lives than what we do on our own lives. It's our children. You indicated you have young children. I have an 11-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and I'm concerned about them. But the high school students get it. When I start talking about the regulations and I talk about what would you do if you were a factory that was faced with having to pay big fines because you couldn't comply, not didn't want to, couldn't physically and time-wise comply with an EPA regulation, what happens to those jobs? You know what they say? I don't have to teach them this. They already know it. Those jobs go somewhere else,
Sure.
usually to China.
Sure.
And they know, and we talk about the money issue, and you've talked about that, and you're absolutely right. They know that if we create a regulatory environment that's conducive to creation of jobs, not no regulations, but conducive to creating jobs, that we end up with more jobs. You end up with more jobs, you have more taxpayers. You have more taxpayers, you have more taxes. And guess what? Just like in our households, if you have more money coming in, it's a whole lot easier to pay your bills going out. And so when we talk about living within our means, we can live within our means at a higher level if we just have the ability for the American entrepreneurial spirit and the American entrepreneur to go out and take the normal risks that are associated with any business enterprise and create the jobs that over the last centuries we as Americans have worked hard to create, and in a mere 200 years created the greatest economic system, the greatest economic country ever seen on this planet. And I have to say, it comes back to you talked about Dodd-Frank and banks. The regulations, community banks in particular. And I come from a very rural district compared to a lot of the others. And, you know, the community banks are the heart and soul of those communities, and yet they are afraid to lend money to people they know are going to stay there and fight to keep those jobs and to fight for their communities, but they're hesitant to lend the money because they don't know what the regulatory scheme is going to be. Well, so not only do you have the entrepreneur who doesn't know, but the banker doesn't know, so he doesn't know if he can lend money even to that entrepreneur. Yeah, I yield back.
Well, gentlemen, you know, I have heard story after story from small-town bankers, community bankers, who say that not only are they deciding not to loan to folks based on character, based on relationship, but they're being told they can't. They're being told they can't. They are, community banks, the sources of credit, the source of money for small-town America, are being told who they can and cannot lend to. Their judgment's being taken away from them and saying, look, you don't have to decide. We're going to regulate that. We'll tell you who you can loan to, who you can't loan to, never mind the fact that you've known them for 20, 30, 40 years, and generation after generation. We're going to control this from Washington. Wall Street, this president talks about his financial reform bill going after Wall Street. Actually, the folks on Wall Street backed it. What it ended up doing is hurting the folks that had nothing to do with the financial collapse in the first place. Small-town community banks got the brunt of a lot of this because the big banks can afford the extra regulation and compliance. The small banks cannot. So what the President's bill did, it ignored Fannie, it ignored Freddie, the problems, and then it went after banks, made Wall Street happy in many ways. Many of them got on board and endorsed it. And then who took the brunt of the burden, the regulatory burden? Small-town banks. Small-town banks. I yield back.
And I would have to say, you said it, that Wall Street backed it, but I guarantee you Main Street didn't back it.
That's right.
And Main Street had problems with it. And I feel, you know, personal about this because as a young lawyer right out of law school, I took some risks. I had to go to the bank. The bank that I'd been dealing with wouldn't work with me on buying a building, but one of my community banks stepped up to the plate and they said, you know what? We know that as long as you're alive, you'll pay this loan, even if business isn't good. We count on you because we have known you since you were a kid, and we know exactly that you're going to be there and you're going to do things. Without that money, I dare say that I wouldn't have had a successful law practice for 28 years. You know, a lot of times people don't think of lawyers as businessmen, but if you're a sole practitioner like I was for many, many years, you've got to make the payroll and you've got to pay your loans and you've got to do the things that you have to do. Well, guess what's happening? Right now, that loan wouldn't be made to me today. Another young man in a situation like I was in who wanted to go out and practice on his own and make his way in his hometown wouldn't be allowed to do that under the current regulatory scheme, and that's that job plus the jobs of all the people who I had working for me in that office as I went forward with my practice. So you're absolutely right in what you say, and further, I have to get back to your Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act. I have said for some time, I wish I had introduced the bill, but I have said for some time, if we would put a freeze on new regulations and say to the American entrepreneur, the business people out there, if you invest in the United States now, we will give you a window where you don't have to worry about any new regulations. We would turn this economy around like that, and we would see that unemployment rate not just drop by 0.1 or 0.2, but we would see it drop down to your 6% that you've put in there, and I think we would even see it drop below that 6% if people knew that they could count on having not no regulation, but reasonable regulations and not have to worry about new regulations during this time of economic stress. And I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. I know we're running short on time, so I just want to say to the folks listening out there, wherever you may be, these are not new ideas. Some of the ideas you've heard tonight on tax reform, regulatory reform, energy exploration, making the federal government live within its means, investing in infrastructure. These are not ideas that just came up this week. You may ask yourself, why haven't we passed these a long time ago? Why haven't we worked on this before? Why are we just talking about it now? We have been for over a year. For over a year, we have been working on these issues. Many of these ideas we've passed. Let's take tax reform. We talked about that in our budget over a year ago, or it'll be a year, I guess, in April. Regulatory reform. I can't count the number of bills, not including mine, I just introduced mine, but we have passed bill after bill after bill that deal with regulatory reform. What about energy exploration? I literally can't count the number of bills that we've passed that deal with energy exploration, particularly the Keystone Pipeline. Bill after bill after bill. If there's any softening in the President's position on the Keystone XL pipeline, you can bet it's because we have been relentless in this House, pushing the President to allow for the construction of that pipeline. We've got a long way to go, but we'll keep pushing. On the issue of the budget and living within our means, we've been fighting this battle for over a year. So none of this is brand spanking new. A lot of these ideas we've been fighting for over a year, and we'll continue to. But we've got to keep talking about them. Keep talking about them. So what's happened after we passed them? Well, a significant number, almost 30, about 30 or so, have passed this House, and they go right down to the other side of the building, and they sit in the Senate. Many of us grew up in the 1970s and saw the little cartoon, Schoolhouse Rock. The little Bill sitting on Capitol Hill, the steps out here somewhere. That little cartoon taught me the fundamentals of our democracy, how a bill becomes law. Passes this House, then what happens? Well, it has to go down to the Senate. Unfortunately, they haven't passed a budget out of the Senate in over 1,000 days. So you can bet they haven't passed our bills either. So we've addressed a lot of this stuff. And we're going to keep talking about it and keep pushing and keep pushing. But a lot of it's sitting right down there in the Senate, waiting for action, going nowhere. So, if you're wondering what's happened to these ideas, that's where they are. And we are continuing to work on them here, continuing to pressure the Senate and the President to try to work with us to get this stuff done, because these pillars, tax reform, regulatory reform, energy exploration, getting the federal government to live within its means and having a common sense budget, and as part of that, addressing our infrastructure issues, all of those together, they all relate to jobs. So we'll keep fighting for jobs. And I yield back the balance of my time to the gentleman from Mississippi, my good friend, the Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. The Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for 30 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are the best of times, and in some ways the worst of times. Our freedoms are under assault, and some people in places of leadership do not appreciate the threat to our freedoms and therefore are naively assisting those who would take them away. We know that in recent days in Afghanistan, we had some soldiers who were given the responsibility to burn Qurans, which were being used by prisoners to write messages of an incendiary nature to other prisoners. Well, it's my understanding of Sharia law that to write in such a Quran could be considered a desecration. Yet there's been no protest, no outrage over prisoners using the Quran to pass inflammatory messages to other prisoners. And we've also seen the death of Americans as a result. 2 officers, along with others, have been killed and injured. Our Commander-in-Chief has seen fit to apologize to those who house the killers of our 2 American officers. When I think about the feelings of the family members of the 2 American officers who were serving, to have a commander not do as Lincoln and so many commanders-in-chief have done in the past, wherein they sent those troubling letters to grieving families to thank them for their service and to truly grieve with the families. No, in this case, the Commander-in-Chief sent messages instead to the home of the killers, or the killer. Now we're led to believe by some internationally that, gee, it just overwhelmed the killer of the 2 officers. But then we hear that he may have taken a silencer with him to work. Well, where I come from, courts that I've been in to prosecute, my court as a judge, my region as a Chief Justice, that would be considered evidence of premeditation, of first-degree murder. And yet we apologize to those who think like the murderer. I haven't heard a demand for an apology from Afghanistan and from the leaders of Afghanistan who would not be in office but for the lives and sacrifice of American soldiers. They wouldn't be there but for American soldiers. Yeah, thank you. Yet no apology from Afghanistan. So I think we have to look a little deeper what is really going on here. We know that in the United States it's been deemed to be just fine to stick a cross that symbolizes the death and sacrifice of Jesus Christ in a beaker of urine. Now, some of us believe that anybody that would do such a thing without repenting before they leave this life will have a special price to pay by the judge of all judges, by that same Creator which gave us our inalienable rights. But not only was that done, it was funded by the United States government NEA funds. We've been told repeatedly that there is nothing unconstitutional about burning an American flag. That flag for which so many millions of Americans have given the last full measure of devotion. We're told that it doesn't violate our Constitution to burn American Bibles, that that's just fine under our Constitution. Yet we even have great Americans who have risked their life for this country, who see the death and loss of lives, say, you know what, maybe we ought to have a law that says you can't burn a Quran or you can't shoot at a Quran. Some may recall that in May 22nd of 2008, there was a U.S. soldier that shot at a Quran, and that sparked unrest, and there were 2 civilians and a Lithuanian that were killed as a result of that. Some people may remember last year when a pastor in Florida burned a Quran, sparked rioting. 11 were killed, including 7 UN workers. What's really going on here? Well, I think it's important to look back to the Organization of Islamic, what used to be Islamic Conference, now has been changed to Islamic Cooperation. And we can find some things. I've got a chart here to show. This is from the 3rd extraordinary session of the Islamic Summit. It outlines the 10-year program of action to meet the challenges facing the Muslim Ummah in the 21st century. And this is the Islamic Summit Conference results. And it's important to note that the term Islamophobia was invented for just such occasions to try to demonize Americans or so-called Westerners who might try to say there's such a thing as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, who would seek to subjugate our First Amendment rights to the Islamic Conference, their rules, and Sharia law. In the plan, the 10-year plan from December of 2005, the plan is, here number 2, affirm the need to counter Islamophobia through the establishment of an observatory at the OIC General Secretariat to monitor all forms of Islamophobia, issue an annual report thereon, and ensure cooperation with the relevant governmental and non-governmental organizations in order to counter Islamophobia. Also, to endeavor to have the United Nations adopt an international resolution to counter Islamophobia and call upon all states to enact laws to counter it, including deterrent punishments. That's right. This is in compliance with the 10-year plan from 2005 to subjugate Americans' First Amendment rights under our Constitution to Sharia law. It's not a terribly complicated effort, but it is brutal. It's cost so many lives, all in an effort to not only show disdain for actions of Westerners regarding the Quran, but also to push to get the UN and all states, such as the United States, to adopt laws to punish any what Sharia would consider inappropriate use or abuse of a Quran. I happen to think, as a Christian, it's terribly inappropriate to abuse a Quran, and would encourage people not to do so. I would likewise say that it is a terrible thing to abuse a Bible and to abuse a flag. It shouldn't be done. But as a service member, prosecutor, judge, Chief Justice, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that means all rights under our Constitution. So just so people don't forget, I think it is appropriate to remember what's in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably or to peaceable assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's all right. Just sit back. We're supposed to have the right to freedom of speech. The Supreme Court has said that means you can burn a flag, you can burn a Bible, you can burn a Quran. But there is a movement in all 57 states, that's right, 57 states of the OIC, to get the UN and all countries to subjugate their freedoms to Sharia law. So that, sure, it's okay to burn a Bible, burn a flag, that's fine, but not a Quran. It's wrong to do so, but it's not illegal. We're told, as of today, that the Taliban says the airport blast in Afghanistan was revenge for Quran burnings. This article today points out that 40 people have been killed in protests and related attacks since the incident became known this past Tuesday, including 4 U.S. soldiers. NATO, France, Britain, and the U.S. have pulled their advisors from Afghan ministries out of concern that the anti-foreigner anger might erupt again. After all we've done. But it's not over. These people feel they still must subjugate our First Amendment rights to Sharia law. First Amendment should be pretty clear. And it should be noted that until the 1950s, when Lyndon Johnson basically got tired of churches yapping at him over what they deemed moral issues, he shut them up by adding an additional provision added to the tax laws that basically forbade any church or such organization from getting involved in politics. My children were surprised, based on what they'd been taught in public school, that for most of this country's history, churches were the bedrock. Churches were involved in every great movement that occurred, both in the Revolution, in the civil rights movement that resulted in the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Lest we forget, Martin Luther King Jr. was an ordained Christian minister. He knew and espoused the true way, truth, and light. Well, the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam was established in 1990. And so when we hear about the calls for human rights under Sharia law, it is important to understand what that means. This is from the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam from August of 1990. Article 24 says all the rights and freedoms stipulated in this declaration are subject to the Islamic Sharia. Article 25, the Islamic Sharia is the only source of reference for the explanation or clarification of any of the articles of this declaration. That's what we're talking about. When the term human rights are utilized, it's important for people to understand that under this Declaration of Human Rights that is still being forwarded today and thrust at us, it's important to note that those are considered human rights only under the definition of Sharia. So when we're told about the OIC believing and pushing human rights, that means no one has the right to desecrate a Quran in any way, although they can burn Bibles and American flags all day long. It means no one has the freedom of speech to draw a cartoon about Muhammad, because if they do, they have the human right to be executed. If someone is a Muslim and they pronounce that Jesus Christ has become their Lord, then they have the human right to be executed. If someone is a woman testifying under the laws of Sharia, she has the right to have her testimony only count as half of that of a man. Under these terms, if a woman inherits from a male, she has the human right to receive just 1/2 of the inheritance that a man would. Under Sharia, as to those women on whose part ye fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last beat them. So if a husband is displeased with his wife, the woman has the human right to be beaten. This goes on and on. I'm surprised that the women's rights movement have not been more assertive in pointing out the inequalities that occur in countries that espouse Sharia and the threat that it poses to women's rights all over the world and in America. Under Sharia, to bring a claim of rape, a Muslim woman must present 4 male Muslim witnesses in good standing. Islam places the burden of avoiding illicit sexual encounters entirely on the woman. In effect, under Sharia, women who bring a claim of rape without being able to produce 4 male Muslim witnesses admitting they're admitting to having had illicit sex. If she or the man is married, this amounts to an admission of adultery, and she should be punished. Some believe stoned to death, at a minimum flogged, if she is raped and can't produce 4 men of Muslim good standing on her behalf. She has the human right to be flogged, or in some eyes, to be stoned to death. There are those who are saying we should get out of Afghanistan now. Actually, we could have done that a long time ago if a different course had been pursued. It is not inappropriate to note that in so many circumstances, the enemy of our enemy should be considered our friend. I've met, along with Dana Rohrabacher, Steve King, we've met twice with Northern Alliance leaders, and although these brave leaders and their soldiers, their horse soldiers, did what some intelligence and special ops individuals have indicated is perform acts of heroism and gallantry such as they'd never seen before on their behalf and on behalf of America. The Taliban was initially defeated, people forget, when we had initially less than 200, at no point more than 1,500 American special ops and intelligence just embedded with the Northern Alliance, assisting them as the enemy of the Taliban. Our friends, the Northern Alliance, they're Muslim. They're our Muslim friends. But they did not want the intolerance of the Taliban and were willing to pay any price, just as the founders were, to prevent having the Taliban take them over, and as they had done before, burn films, burn books, burn art, dictate to the women, prevent their freedoms. The Northern Alliance helped us by basically being the people that defeated the Taliban. We provided them the arms to do it. We provided them the aerial support, and they did it. We disarmed them. Told them they had nothing to worry about. We added over 100,000 troops and became occupiers. We tried the nation bill. We gave them a constitution that provides for Sharia law. Where is the apology to Afghan Christians for us getting them a constitution that does not permit public churches? The last Christian church in Afghanistan has closed. Last account I'd seen, there was one acknowledged Jewish person living in Afghanistan. Now there's intolerance. We have a $12.5 billion government in Afghanistan. That's their budget. And they provide about $1.5 billion of their own. You know what happens to that government when we pull out? That's why the Taliban is telling people, even on Afghan television, we're going to be in charge as soon as the U.S. pulls out. There are ways to deal with this issue, and if you just look at the map, you get a good idea what we're talking about. During a recent trip to Afghanistan and meeting with Baluch people. See, let's first look at the map itself. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, India. Now, before 1948, this area in here was Baluchistan. 1948, the arbitrary lines that were drawn put Baluchistan in with Pakistan. This used to be a Baluch area. And as a recent Pakistan Daily News editorial pointed out, most of Pakistan's natural resources come from this area. As people have advised us in Afghanistan, when I was over there recently, the Taliban are being supported by supplies, arms. They're getting their support from southern Pakistan into southern Afghanistan. They're coming through the Baluch area. The Baluch don't want that. They're Muslim. They're our friends. They want to be our friends. They would be wonderful friends. They have been terrorized by the Pakistani government for decades, and we've stood by and didn't seem to care. The world has. Well, perhaps it is time to recognize an independent Baluchistan where we'd have a friend who would not keep supplying the enemy of America. Those people that helped train and prepare for 9/11 to kill as many thousands of Americans as they could. We don't want to leave Afghanistan in the hands of the Taliban and all the American life and treasure be for nothing, but there is an easy answer. We leave, but we empower the enemy of our enemy, the Northern Alliance and the Baluch people. Let them take care of their own area. Let them prevent the Taliban from taking over. Let them prevent Pakistan from becoming such a focused enemy as they have, unabated. Let them worry. India wants to be our friend. If we look at the area of Pakistan, well, this shows the different major ethnic groups. Pink here is the Baluch people. Green is the Pashtun. And, of course, only a tiny percentage of the Pashtun people make up the Taliban. But virtually all of the Taliban is made up of Pashtun. And they do come over here into Pakistan. And then we have brown as the Punjabi, and the yellow is the Sindhi. Northern Alliance is up here. You've got a number of different groups up there, including Uzbeks. But these are people who do not want the Taliban to ever take over. They're the enemy of our enemy, and that's where we can do some real good. It's time to stop the support of those who would take away our First Amendment rights. Heck, there's an article, military, this is from CNN, May 20th, 2009. Military personnel threw away and ultimately burned confiscated Bibles that were printed in the two most common Afghan languages amid concern that they would be used to try to convert Afghans, a Defense Department spokesman said Tuesday. The unsolicited Bibles sent by a church in the United States were confiscated about a year ago at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan because military rules forbid troops of any religion from proselytizing while deployed there. Such religions' outreach can endanger American troops and civilians in the devoutly Muslim nation. Why would it endanger civilians if they have the rights that Americans say we're fighting for? Why? We're burning Bibles the American military did back in 2009. I was given this Bible by my aunt, told that it was provided during World War II. My uncle says, "May the Lord be with you." It's a New Testament. And inside the front cover it says, "As Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces of the United States. Throughout the centuries, men of many faiths and diverse origins have found in the sacred book words of wisdom, counsel, and inspiration. It is a fountain of strength and now, as always, an aid in attaining the highest aspirations of this human soul." Signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. That wasn't signed by President Obama. It was signed by Franklin Roosevelt, and it was given to our soldiers. Well, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, let me just say, if the President takes more action to demean the American rights and eliminate our own rights, then it's time for the President to apologize, not to Afghanistan, but to the American